We're looking for one thing. We're looking for a pouch.
Right. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, first of all, we're going to do a little review in the form of a group quiz. I'll do a pop quiz, but a review quiz. Okay. So, you remember how, you ever played, I think it's called Scramble in golf, where you play according to the person who's the best? Well, we're going to, whoever gets the right answer is, so if nobody gets the answer, then you all miss that one. But as long as one person gets it right, then you all have passed that particular question. Okay, what is equivalence? What is equivalence? So remember how over here we have the formal, equivalence, and then over here we have the functional. Equivalence. What is equivalence?
No way else.
Yep, go ahead, try it.
It's a fancy way of saying equal, I think.
Yeah, fancy way of saying equal. So what in the old language can be communicated this way in our language? Obviously, we don't speak this morning in Greek or Hebrew, right? Okay, we speak in English. So we have to take things that meant something back then, and we have to do the equivalent. So a half dozen is equivalent to 6 eggs, right? Okay, thank you, Allie. That's fine. I know what you meant. So a half dozen is equivalent to 6. We're talking about a half dozen eggs, 6. That's what it means. You with me so far? Okay. Next question. What does formal mean? Formal equivalence. Jeremiah?
More word for word.
Okay. Yes, and kind of no. So somebody elaborate on what Jeremiah means there. So it's more word for word, but it's obviously not referring to like one English word for one Greek or Hebrew word. So what does formal mean in a different way? Jeremiah's half right.
It's translating more according to the lexical definitions.
Yeah, perhaps. Okay. Anybody else want to add some more light to that?
It's trying to communicate exactly what the previous language.
Okay, it's the definition. Guys, give you half credit for that question. Okay, so you actually can keep a pretty simple definition, and it's this: you try to retain as much of the form or the structure of the original language as possible. Does that make sense? Much the form of it as you can. Okay, next question. Functional. What does the word functional mean in a functional equivalence?
We care less about the form and more about the general meaning.
Yes, yeah, you're trying to communicate not necessarily with one English word for one Greek or Hebrew word. You're like, okay, what is the sense of this word? So Alex talked about the lexical definition. Well, that's the yes and no, in the sense that when you look at functional translations, even something like the NLT, sometimes you will find that exact definition written in the Greek lexicon. But it doesn't retain as much of the form as it does the structure, the grammatical structure. It might break it up into 5 sentences instead of 2 sentences, something like that. Okay? Next question. Idiom. By the way, not to be confused with idiots. Okay? Idiom. What does idiom mean? Allie.
A phrase conveying a meaning, usually using imagery.
Yeah, that's a fantastic definition. You get bonus credit for that one. Okay, you get your half point back. Yeah, what? Okay. All right, so you're taking a picturesque concept in one language that doesn't necessarily communicate into another language. We've looked at some examples of that. Okay, parlance. What's that word? I haven't really defined that very much so far, but it's right in there in the midst of our discussion about Bible words and language. What does parlance mean? Like parlance. That? Oh wait, no, that's not the right word. What's parlance mean?
In the natural speaking of the day.
In the natural speaking of the day. So we want to communicate things in the modern parlance. Thank you, Roberta. Okay, interpretation. What does interpretation mean? This is one of those questions that could have a lot of different answers. What does interpretation mean?
Taking the meaning of the original language.
Yeah.
Putting it in a modern form.
You're trying to figure out what it means. Now, I spent 2.5 lessons going through interpretation, defining what it means, when supposedly those who are doing formal equivalents are doing less interpretation, and those who are doing functional equivalents are doing quote-unquote more interpretation. By the way, Liam, can you do that cool little thing with the camera where you switch it back and forth so we can, people who are watching can kind of see what I'm looking at?
Do you want me to leave it up there and just twist it, or do you want me to set up the table?
Either one, whatever's easier for you. Now that it's already hooked up there, it might just be easier just to rotate it. Okay. All right, so the question is, true or false? Functional translations do more interpretation than formal translations. Functional translations do more interpretation than formal translations. True or false?
Or what do you define interpretation? I think that'll help us.
Okay, so that's the question, right? Alex, you look like you're about to explain something.
I just said false.
Okay, yeah. So you kind of know what people mean when they say that, because obviously there are things in functional translations that are not that way in formal translations. But what they're doing is, and if you remember some of our examples, see if I can find them in my little note here. Nope, that's not it. I should have written these down ahead of time. Okay, number one, it's on the left there, you probably can't see it very well. Specificity. Each translation has to decide to what extent it needs to specify something. B, confidence, that one interpretation is correct. I call this risky business. Next one is A, B, C, here we go. C, intuition. Has to decide what their modern readers will intuitively understand. And then D, whether to retain a traditional rendering or whether to diverge from the traditional rendering. So the answer is mostly false, that functional translations do more interpretation. They just handle things in a less formal way. Okay, what do you think? Did you pass the quiz? I think I gave you passing grade. Passing time? Yeah. Okay. All right. Next. If they all do interpretation, and as we learned in a previous lesson, that sometimes they flip. Do you remember that? How we looked at sometimes they go back and forth. The functional are actually more quote-unquote literal than the formal translations. If they sometimes flip and they all do interpretation, are spectrum charts like this accurate? Are they accurate? I'm going to give you two answers to this. First of all, this isn't a quiz, by the way. I'm going to answer that question for you. First answer to this question is, are they accurate? To a certain extent, yes. Generally speaking, those translations that are on the left side, the formal equivalents, will tend to be in that direction. They're not wildly off. It's not like the New American Standard is a functional translation or something like that. But it's, and the same is true too. Like you never say that the NLT or the NCV, the New Century Version, is a formal equivalence translation. Yet, every translation is less consistent in maintaining their kind of equivalence as they translate it through the Bible. So here's one big truth to remember when it comes to this. The difference between ideal and real. So if you were to read the preface to the New American Standard, it will say something like, we strive to be literal as possible. It says something like that. So you would think that therefore, assuming that literal and formal are kind of the same thing, that the range that the New American Standard is in is, say, something like this. So most of its translations are in the literal, but every once in a while, you might have something over toward the more functional side of things. But there is a book that I read by Dave Brunn called One Bible, Many Versions, in which he shows hundreds of examples at how even translations like the New American Standard or the ESV, which claim to be literal or essentially literal, actually don't match up with their ideals. In other words, the real doesn't match up with their ideals. So he has this cool chart, which I'll draw for you, and then I'll show you his actual chart from this book, in which he shows that they may claim that most of their translations are formal, they're toward this side of things, but in reality, a translation like the New American Standard or the ESV is actually more like that, and sometimes even more like that. So that's the drawing. Let me show you his chart from his book. So you can kind of ignore all these arrows and stuff like that and just focus on this down here. Ideal, you see that right there? And then real. In other words, what quote-unquote literal translations attempt to do, they say in their preface, this is our goal, this is our ideal. They don't actually attain to that goal as well as they think that they do. Does that mean that it's a bad translation to use? Does that mean you shouldn't use it? You can stay away from the New American Standard and the ESV? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that no matter what translation you choose, especially those of the quote-unquote literal kind, are not as quote-unquote literal as they say that they are. No translation, even the functional ones, stay true to their goals. No translation is even consistent. So even the New Living Translation, which you would think would kind of be in this range right there, right? That would kind of be the range. In actuality, he shows examples in his books, hundreds of them, that actually at times they go over there and uses a quote-unquote more literal translation. Now, here's why the chart is still mostly pretty accurate. It's because it is true that for the most part, the more formal translations do have more translations on this side of things. It's not as if the NLT should be shoved over to this side. But it is true that you would think that the New Living Translation or something like it would have all of its functional translations over here. But his charts and his examples show that oftentimes they go even over there into the mediating. This is the mediating, if you remember this. Mediating, in other words, in between. In between. And they go over there as well. Here's why, whether formal or functional translations aren't very consistent. Because translation is easy in theory, but it's pretty hard in practice. Those who have taken first or second Greek or Hebrew know that it's pretty easy to get something into what was kind of oddly put, Greeklish. It's not really English, and it kind of looks like Greek, but it's using English letters and English words because it doesn't make that much sense. It's really hard to make something that's accurate and yet doesn't sound very Greeky. Now maybe you're thinking, but my translation that I like, fill in the blank, ESV, NIV, New American Standard, it says that it is the most accurate. My translation says that. It's right there in the preface. It says that the most accurate translation. Okay, so bear with me. Imagine if the translation preface said this: to the best of our ability, we have strived to be as accurate as possible, but Another translation might do it better, to be honest. We're all sinful and human after all. We've tried to be readable too, but all of us in the translation committee are finite, of course. We can't know for sure what's going to be readable for you or anyone else. Now, we tend to lean toward the fill-in-the-blank formal or functional equivalent side of things, but we do it inconsistently. We do it imperfectly, using the opposite approach pretty often too. So if you don't like our translation, I think you should check out this translation, this translation, and this translation, because they're pretty good too. What do you think? That sound like a pretty good preface to a translation? I think it'd be a fantastic preface to a translation. But none of them say that. Why?
They want to sell their translation.
Yeah, exactly. They all think that their translation does the best. A translation's preface is going to implicitly tell you in the preface that it does things the best, and other translations don't do it as good as they do. But I'm here to tell you, ignore the hype. Ignore the hype, as the sign in the Cincinnati Children's bathroom says. Ignore the hype, don't flush a wipe. Well, hear this. Ignore the hype, don't trust their gripe. Because all these translations complain about the other ones as not being as accurate. And I tell you what, they all do a pretty good job. And because, as Liam remarked, they're all trying to sell copies. And that's okay, too. No translation needs to stay true to its formal roots or functional equivalent roots. Or goals, I should say. After all, we live in the 21st century, not the 1st century. Some things that were commonplace back then aren't commonplace now, so they need some explanation. In other words, we need a break from the formal equivalents. And even though the original manuscripts were perfect, we're not. Human beings are not perfect. We're not computers able to translate exactly the perfect way. To my knowledge, maybe somebody can inform me differently, there is no computer-based translation. There's no robot who's ever translated the Bible. But why is that? Because even if one were to exist, it wouldn't know what is common, what's normal, what is spoken. It would sound like a robot trying to be a human. It would sound something like this. This is a robot Twitter composer. Let this robot Twitter composer serenade you with randomly generated music. Okay, you ready for this? This is pretty awesome. Pretty brilliant, huh? This is called Mario Paint. This one's pretty good too. I like this one. And 5/4 nonetheless. Now this one is my favorite. 1812 cannons.
Machine gun.
Okay. So you get the idea, right? Robots can't do things like create music very well or translate Bibles very well. I just wish that the translators of the Bibles would be honest with how often they don't achieve their goals. But they don't. They don't do it. So what can you do about these translations' lack of consistency? Why they're not completely formal or consistently formal or completely or consistently functional? First of all, just read the preface. At least read it. How many of you ever read a preface to a Bible translation? Hey, wow, good for you guys. That's awesome. 2, understand that no translation is able to keep their goals consistently. 3, realize that their prefaces are to some degree marketing. You're trying to sell translations. Literal translations, for whatever reason in our evangelical culture for the last 100 and something years, have tended to prefer literal translations to the more functional or dynamic ones. So we've been taught implicitly that literal equals better. So they're not lying, but they are trying to say, hey, our translation is literal, because they want to say, hey, you should buy our copy. Now, does that mean that all translation is propaganda? And as some would argue, that we should go back to the King James, because that's the only one that's not trying to sell you something and sell copies because it's public domain. Well, for one, in Britain, the King James is still under the copyright of the Crown, so it's not public domain over there, even if it is here in America. But also, no, they have to sell copies to stay in business. They want to stay in business. They want you to sell copies. There's a translation that most of you probably haven't heard of called the ISV, the International Standard Version, which, if I understand correctly, it's basically gone out of business perhaps because of poor marketing, and maybe also because the pioneer who started the translation recently died. So it's basically not going to ever be updated again because there's no marketing, there's no pioneer or founder to move things along. Number 4, remember that this fact that we have scores of evangelical Bible translations in English. And that means we are so blessed. We are so stinking blessed. Okay, so to my question, they're all interpretation. Are charts like this accurate? Second, yes, but there are other angles or spectrums to keep in mind when considering what translation to use. So let me erase some of this. I'll draw you some new charts here, spectrums, if you will. Okay, so this is, we'll call this one the standard. Call that one standard. Now we'll do number 2. This is a different kind of chart, but same concept. Instead of formal, mediating, and functional, we're going to call this archaic or traditional. Traditional. So here's your spectrum, okay? Instead of formal versus functional, we're going to say archaic versus vernacular. What's vernacular mean, by the way?
Common language of the day.
Common language of the day. The modern parlance. Right? Okay? So obviously on this side, yeah, what's the most archaic translation we have people tend to use today? KJV. Yep. How many of you have read through the entire Bible in the King James Version? All right. Okay, what's next after King James? New King James. Yep. Yeah. New King James. Now, after that, you have probably the ESV. Well, yeah, the RSV. Who said that? Yeah, the RSV is probably in here, but that's hardly anybody uses that anymore. In fact, it's not even on that chart. Okay, then you have the RSV, then the ESV, and then interestingly, you have the New American Standard after it. Notice that the switch. So up here is ESV and NASB, but here you have ESV and then NASB. And then over here you would have NIV 84, that's the previous edition. And then you'd have NIV 2011. And then you'd have CSB, and then NET Bible, and then NLT over here. So archaic versus traditional. You'll notice how some of these are going to switch because different of them have different emphases. Yes?
Is that the 95 NASB or the
95, yeah. You would put the New American Standard 2020 probably over here somewhere. Something like that. No, this is just arbitrary. I'm kind of coming up with this myself, okay? Then you have a different chart, different spectrum. And these are all things that you implicitly think about when you're trying to pick up a translation and trying to understand why does this translation do this? Fill in the blank. The third one is elegance. Now this is the most, probably more debated than something like archaism, so we can kind of understand, like, for instance, the use of the word shall, okay? So the CSB has no shalls at all. There's not a single word use of the word shall in the CSB. But interestingly, the NIV 11 and the 84 both use the word shall. And actually, even the NET and NLT occasionally use the word shall. So you can make a 2B chart, and it would be slightly different because CSB is the only translation of these ones here that has no use of the word shall. So it would actually be way over here when it comes to the vernacular. Okay, what I was going to say was elegance. So over here, we have more elegant. And over here, you have less elegant. Now, what would most people say is the most elegant translation you can buy today? The KJV. It's got a new cadence to it. Sounds Shakespearean, Elizabethan. So once again, the KJV is over here on the left side. And then, interestingly, most people say that the ESV is probably the next elegant one. The New King James, I don't hear of anybody claiming that the New King James is more elegant than the ESV. Most people would agree that the ESV is more elegant than the New King James. And then, this is all arbitrary, of course, the 84 NIV, and then the NIV 2011. Should put that up there. So what's interesting about the elegance part is that people, without even thinking about it, tend to rely upon the archaisms as being elegant. But the NIV actually uses a lot of these King Jamesisms, more than you would tend to think. But nobody, a few people, tend to just love the New American Standard, any edition, for being elegant. It's pretty clunky and wooden for most people's uses. But then when it comes to elegance, I'm not hearing nice things about the CSB either. Maybe you could switch those two, maybe. I'm not sure. This is arbitrary, of course. And then if you've ever read the Net Bible, it's just kind of an odd duck.
It really is.
Yeah, it takes a still conservative translation, but it's just odd.
Yeah.
And then I don't know where to put the NLT, so I'm going to put it over here somewhere. It may go back here somewhere, I'm not sure. But do you see how when you're reading things, some of these things you just kind of inherently know, you think about, but you don't necessarily know why it is that it is? Well, these charts might help you. Okay, that's one chart. And here's another one that you might have never thought of, and it's that of measurement units. Okay? So let me do I'm going to chart here, and this is not going to be quite the same as the others, but because it really is, it's hard to put it on a spectrum like this. But you have the original idiom versus a vernacular idiom. A translation like the New American Standard, especially the 2020, tends to keep all the original measurement units. Something like, here's an example, Luke 24:13. Who would look that up in the New American Standard 2020? And who would look up that same verse, Luke 24:13 in the ESV? Luke 24:13. Which one do you want to do? ESV. Who would do the NASB 2020? Alex? Alex, would you read yours first? We've got it. Luke 24:13.
And behold, on that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, which was 60 stadia from Jerusalem.
Okay, is there a footnote there?
Yes.
What's the footnote say?
Possibly about 7 miles or 11.3 kilometers.
Okay, Jenna, what's the ESV say?
That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem.
Yeah, so you have on the one hand, the New American Standard 2020, which translates, as far as I'm aware, everything in the original idiom. It uses the original word there's a whole chart. Let's see if I can find a chart in the back of my Bible of these terms. If you have a hard copy Bible, you could probably flip to the back of your Bible and find the same thing. Okay, there's talent, mina or mina, shekel, pim, becca, gerah, derrick, cubit, span, handbreadth, stadion, core, lethek, ephah, sia, omer, cab, bath, hin, and log. These are all terms that are used in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, to note measurements of unit, like distance, or how much something weighs, or how big something is. And most translations are somewhere in between.
It's still wrong.
So the ESV, NIV, both editions, mostly have a little bit of both. They kind of go back and forth. I kind of wish they would have picked one or the other, but they kind of go back and forth. Interestingly, the CSB, is the most consistent. In fact, that's too far to the right. That's too far to the right. The CSB is the most consistent in putting things in modern terms. But then you have to decide, do you want American measurements of unit, or do you want international measurements of unit? And which one do you want to put in the text? The CSB uses American units. That's why when you're reading the Old Testament, you're going to be like, wait, 125 and a half of whatever? And you're like, what? That's the number that? No. That's because they took whatever the original idiom was, stadia or core or whatever, and they put it into the modern vernacular, and so the numbers are going to be off. They're not going to look as round as the original units. But even it is not consistent. Even sometimes it uses the original idiom rather than the vernacular idiom. Questions on that before I do the last one? Okay, now this is where it gets kind of controversial on this one. And it's that of language changing. To what extent does a translation, or translations, translators, probably speaking, believe that language is changing, so we have to keep it modern and up to date? So on this spectrum, and I know I'm getting kind of low here for some of you to see, you would have, obviously, the KJV. Is this not going anywhere? It hasn't been updated, at least officially, since 1769. You can buy translations called like the Modern English Version, which is basically the King James that's been updated. There's a couple other translations like that. Were you going to say something? No. Okay. So you got the King James. Then, so far as I'm aware, the New King James has not been updated since like 1982 or thereabouts. So it's stayed the same for a long time. And I'm not sure where to put these two, ESV and New American Standard. So the ESV in 2016 released their 2016 update with just minor updates. They called it the, quote, permanent text edition. In other words, where they're never going to change it again. Do you remember this, Alex? No?
I remember them updating it. No.
Yeah, it's called the permanent text edition. There was so much backlash that they changed their minds. And they said, okay, all right, we might change it in the future. Because they realized that, okay, maybe language does change. The New American Standard has updates of the big updates, 77, 95, and 2020. So you're looking at 17, 25 years or thereabouts. That's the kind of span that it thinks every once in a while we need to release a new update. Now, to their credit, they are releasing, they're still producing and publishing all three editions, 77, 95, and 2020. That's to their credit, because the NIV got a lot of flack for introducing their 2011 edition and not still publishing the 84 edition. They got a lot of flack for that. Okay? So then you got the NLT, actually, even though it is a more functional equivalent, they update every probably about 15 to 20 years. It came out in 96, and there's been 1.5, maybe 2 major updates since then. But the one that's actually most frequently updated, by the way, we don't know when the CSB, how often that's going to be updated because they've not specifically told us. But when it comes to the NIV, they are actually the ones who are most aggressive when it comes to updating their text. they have said in their charter, they're translating philosophies, that every 10 to 15 years they will introduce an update to the NIV, the New International Version. So in as early as 2021, which I doubt it, or as late as 2026, we could have a new update to the NIV, because that's in their thing. The reason that's called the New International Version, even though it's been out for like 40-something years, is because they always want to be new. Does that make sense? Now the last one, and this is the most controversial of them all, and it's that of, if you can even see this, inclusivity. We'll look at that in more depth later. But for now, we're just going to put this chart up here, and we will come back to it next time to give just a very brief definition of inclusivity. It's to what extent do you want to leave the grammatically male nouns and pronouns of the original language? Because Greek and Hebrew had a lot of them. So do you want to say he that, or he who, or do you want to say the one who, or do you want to say whoever who, that type of thing? Or like the NLT, do you want to say anyone? Now here's where things get kind of interesting, is that all translations as they go on are becoming more and more inclusive. But that also means that people are not understanding. So I'm going to take at least one, if not two lessons to talk about inclusivism, inclusive language, within the original Bible and the modern day translation of it, because it is such a controversial thing. So when it comes to a spectrum like this, you got the King James, of course. King James always hanging out over here on the left side. And then, of course, you got the New King James, and somewhere in here would probably, New King James, would probably be the RSV, would probably be somewhere in there as well. And then you have the NASB 95. It's not very inclusive. It keeps a lot of those male pronouns and nouns. And then you have the ESV. But the ESV is actually, and we're going to look at this in the coming weeks, more inclusive than you would tend to think. And then you have the NIV. Well, actually, I think I would switch those, actually. Let me go back. Let me put the NIV 84, and then the ESV, and then the CSB, and then the NIV 11. And interestingly, and this could be, you could switch these two in particular. You have the New American Standard 2020. I might switch these, maybe, but they're both pretty inclusive, surprisingly. And then over here, that it's not published anymore, you have the T NIV. It's not published anymore, but some of you might still have a copy sitting around somewhere. I saw a copy in Roberta's library one day, so I know she has a copy. And then what's that?
I said it's still there.
Is it still there? Yeah.
What's the TNIV?
The Today's International Version, published in 2005, is not published anymore. I'll get into some of the history behind that. So one thing to notice before we go to look at this next time in detail is that people tend to think that when it comes to inclusivity, that the ESV is way over here and the NIV 2011 is way over here. Well, they're actually pretty close to each other. And we'll see why the debate came up and why it's so controversial, even within our own circles, our conservative, evangelical, reform circles, because inclusivity is not a bad thing, but it does need to be used carefully. Okay, any questions on any of this? I realize that I'm speaking in very much broad strokes, and that I haven't given very many examples today. That's because we've looked at a lot of examples recently, and because at some point you just got to kind of look at some of the big picture ideas instead of looking at the ground beneath you. Questions? Yes?
Is that me?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Now, what was that name you used when you were up here, like halfway down? You talk about a big controversy. Somebody changed something and people went nuts. And
Yeah, that's inclusivity, and it's regarding the CSB, NIV 2011, and NASB 2020.
Not the NKJV?
Not the NKJV. Well, we're gonna spend at least less, if not two, just on this topic.
You used a phrase too that I didn't remember. What
Gender neutral? Is that what I used?
No, it was something else.
That's what sometimes this is also.
Anyway, it's probably not important, but I just thought it was an interesting phrase you used when it was a big controversy. You said they were going to change something, and everybody had a big uproar about it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Next question is, bear with me if you understand this, but I need a little more explanation on why do they update like 77, 95, 20?
Yeah.
Why do those different, do that? Why? What are they?
Okay, that's a great question. Why update a translation? Right? Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay, so when you read the King James, does this sound outdated to you?
Yes, I mean, I'm used to it. Like, I grew up with that, and
but it at least sounds somewhat outdated. So at some point in there,
yes, I wish
it
not that
became
that was,
at the very least hard to understand, if not unintelligible.
I'm not making fun of it. I'm just like,
So the NIV says that language changes so often that we need to have an update every 10 to 15 years. The New American Standard apparently says language changes and scholarship updates so often that we need to update every 15 to 25 years. So there's a little bit of difference as to how often, but almost everybody, except for maybe the New King James and debated the ESV, agrees that language does change and scholarship changes a little bit. Language changes a lot, but scholarship changes a little bit. So we need to have new translations that are modernized and keep up with the modern scholarship. Because otherwise it'll become like the King James, where eventually you lose understandability.
And they both have new in the name, so that's interesting. Now, I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't know the answer to this one, but I hope you do. Have you studied this a little bit? And I have a question about it because it's a long time since I read it. I read the New Testament by J. Green, Interlinear, but it's not the NKJV, it's the King James 2. And what is the difference?
There are a whole bunch of
Google
updates to the King James Version, like the KJV 2000, the KJV, the MEV, what I mentioned, the Modern English Version. There's probably 5 to 10 of these modern minor updates, but none of them have ever stuck. Nobody's been like, this is the best update of the King James. Now, I say that knowing that the New King James is an update of the King James, but it utilizes at various times some of the other, and maybe I should have put this on there. I suppose I could make a 7th one of charts when it comes to which manuscript basis to use. So you would have over here when you have the traditional Textus Receptus, and then over here you have the critical text. Well, you got your KJV and NKJV, KJV, and then pretty much everybody else uses a critical text to a great degree. You got some WEB here in the middle, but everybody else is going to use the critical text.
And that's the Web Bible or something?
Yeah, the World English Bible, I think it stands for. They use a Byzantine text, but pretty much everybody uses the critical text. We've looked at that in previous weeks.
Now, what about Jerome's Latin Vulgate? They used to mention that it was, that's what the Catholics based theirs on or something. I don't know.
Yeah, so they don't base it on the Greek, they base it on a translation of a translation. So, duoremes and that sort of thing are not based on the original, or at least as close as we can get to the original Greek and Hebrew manuscript. They base it on a translation by Jerome called the Latin Vulgate, which has been around for 1,000+ years, if not 2,000 years. But it's a translation. It's not the original documents. We need to go for the sake of Stacy, but we can entertain Alex's question as we all dismiss and let Stacy know that we're ready.
I was just going to make a comment about your point as to the ESV not changing its language. I'm pretty sure the update in 2016, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that was just an update according to the Nestle Aland, changing some variants.
No, that's not correct.
Oh, really?
Because there is a video, if I'm thinking of the right year, there is a video in which it shows the translators debating whether to change it to bondservant from slave or vice versa.
Oh, okay.
So there are some minor updates, but even still, the ESV updates are, they're not language updates as much as they are like how to best translate this.
Yeah.
So they have a 2001, a 2007, a 2011, and a 2016 updates. But none of them are like, language is changing, so we need to make sure people understand it. It's just going minor, let's translate this better than we used to. I think it's going to stay for a while. I would guess that we have another 5 to 20 years for ESV in its current state.